All right, is there anyone else who would like to comment? Oh, yeah, Ms. Terry.
Hi, Melinda Terry. I think I'm mostly going to be wearing my Central Valley Flood Control Association hat, but probably every once in a while.
You'll slip on over.
Yeah, if I'm talking about water supply and water quality, then just think I'm wearing my North Delta hat, if that is helpful to anyone. So sorry for that, but it's...
Do you really have hats?
Yes, I do.
You should bring them.
I'll wear them one time, yeah.
Good.
Especially if you go on a lot of tours that you've all been on, you have to have a hat. It's always either sunny or rainy, and neither are good. Well, thank you. That was glad to have the presentation. I guess there are just a lot of, when I look at the Delta Reform Act and your statutory obligations that you mentioned last meetings and some of your documents that you have in terms of what you think even your obligations are, water quality certainly is one of them, and I think it kind of got skipped over. I thought I heard you say that there wasn't any, or I didn't. Net zero, is that what you said about water quality, or did I miss water quality altogether? So I missed it maybe, but but in your documents from last month, on getting the habitat restoration done right, one of the things that you talk about for your Delta plan is improve water quality to protect the ecosystem. And in this case, some of those unavoidable impacts that are in the plan are 7. It depends on which one you read. The Bureau gave us a list that they think there's 7. When I read the EIR, there really seemed to be 6 to me, unavoidable impacts. But many of these are exceeding the...
6 unavoidable impacts in the water quality
Quality alone, yeah. There's 750 impacts total in the EIR, EIS.
And I think the testimony was 50 were substantial, right?
48 is unavoidable according to the list that the Bureau gave us. But, and that's the thing with some of the mitigation is you can look at the agriculture, transportation, any of them. I'll use the transportation or ag, it doesn't matter. But a lot of them are conditioned, so it's... whether it's feasible, whether it's cost effective, it's discretionary in terms of what's called BDCP proponents. And they're different than the governing entity, just so you know. And they have a lot of discretion to decide when that person comes out for the noise thing, deciding whether that's really their project or not. And it's not, you've got pile driving that I mentioned. Let's talk about noise, That's happening 25,000 strikes a day, at least near the intakes. But you have the shafts that are along the alignment, and they're every 3 miles. There's going to, you've got the barges, pile driving.
The access tunnels are every 3 miles, roughly.
They're both ventilation and access, and it's about every 3 miles. So you have a lot of noise because you have to dewater around all of these facilities, including the tunnel alignment. And you're talking pumps that can pump anywhere from 30 to 10,500 gallons, according to the EIR, and they're placed every 50 to 75 feet. So it's not just potential noise from even pile driving. That's a lot of noise, and air quality, I don't even know that. And that's why I was saying last month when I was here, that's what's hard when you get such a large plan is that you could have one issue or one impacted thing, but it appears almost in every chapter. And agriculture is a good example of that. I mean, you go into the agricultural chapter and it will say a lot of the impacts in terms of, sure, you've got the loss of the actual conversion of land that will be lost. And, the mitigation that was mentioned, we're going to do easements. Well, their own EIR, EIS says that, and you can look at their maps. They have the maps on there and you'll see all the colors. These lands really, because they are prime farmlands, really are already in a lot of these easements. Either they're the protection zones, the farming protection zones, or security protection zones. And Department of Conservation is who tracks these, and it's in the EIR, or Williamson Act. So I'm not really clear what additional easements, if they're already being farmed and that's what they're doing, it's difficult to understand. But their conditions. So, for instance, if you're dewatering that area, right now, a lot in the agriculture, one of the things that makes it unique, and so you get to what your job is to look at what are the unique values. The agriculture in the Delta is unique. One, the peat soils get talked about in terms of a bad thing, in terms of subsidence, but from an agricultural farming standpoint, it is fantastic and it makes the Delta unique. The reason has two really good properties. One is it's dark brown, and it actually holds in heat. That allows them to have a longer harvesting period than any other area in the state, and they actually can then plan their harvesting based on markets that other areas cannot do. It's also very water absorbent, and so we get to do what I consider a passive watering, if you will. So right now, the drainage and irrigation ditches, we use them to drain them for flood purposes, but when it's time for irrigation, you fill that same ditch, and because we have a shallow groundwater level in the Delta, that just raises that groundwater a little bit more so that it touches the roots. So it's a very passive, low water intensive watering, and as the root sucks that up again, the ditch will drain, and you just put a little bit more water in it, and it passively will continue to water. Well, if you're dewatering these very large areas, where all the facilities are going to go and the alignment and forebays, that's lowering the ability to do that kind. So it will change the watering and irrigation practices that will have to occur. They'll have to do some kind of surface watering, if you will, that may be more water intensive. And the mitigation is a good example of, well, yeah, we're going to try and find you another water supply, but it may not be sufficient to meet the land uses of that property. Well, this dewatering is going to occur for 6 years at least. And so that's a long time to either be asked not to farm, essentially. And ironically, farming-wise, you're either having not enough water due to your sub-irrigation and some of these water practices. Some areas it's the opposite problem. Where we get a lot of habitat, you get that open water or any kind of aquatic water habitat, you get that seepage going on, and so the EIR is very clear that we're just going to have oversaturation. And it's related to that dewatering because when you read the EIS, it admits that all this dewatering, that's a lot of water being taken. It goes around the perimeter, every 50, 75 feet, around the entire perimeter of where you've got all these facilities. And it doesn't really tell us where, though. All it says is, yeah, we know we're going to exceed the local drainage capacity. Okay, well, I really kind of need to know a little bit more specifics from a flood standpoint. Where are you going to be discharging that water? How much? When? Is it going to interrupt, our flood ability or the irrigation systems when they need to irrigate? So it could be a farming impact. And so it's like I said, it's kind of conditioned. You might get replaceable water, but you might not, and it's a really long period. And I didn't really hear in the presentation anything about, I've mentioned before, the EIS is very clear that you get abandonment of businesses and homes. And it is related to even the mitigation and can't get you to a level of being able to live in your home or do business because of the road thing. The mitigation for roads is a good example. Emergency response, the mitigation is you pull over to the side. Well, if you've driven on a levee road, there's not a place to pull over. Now, I guess they could build some places that you could pull over, but that's not been identified. Where those will be.
But that's been a historic problem in the
Sure.
Delta.
But we're talking
roads today.
thousands of trucks on the road now that neither our ag equipment can compete with or the local residents. But in this case, you're talking emergency response vehicles are competing with thousands of trucks on the road that related to construction. So that just becomes, it's very difficult. And we already have a lot of problems. You've mentioned bridges and the ferries are unreliable, and if you have to get rerouted, and a lot of rerouting is going to go on, and that affects a lot of people. But as I said, the water quality, there's 6 constituents there, and they affect the agriculture and our municipal intakes. And they're going to increase the costs. The environmental commitments document that was mentioned, it's 28 pages long. Okay, they haven't fleshed out what they'll commit to you, just that something will be committed to try to address those. It's really difficult for anyone to then determine okay, I'm going to read this impact. They're promising to do something. Unfortunately, we are operating in an area where, there isn't a lot of trust. So that's part of the problem. I think if we could get some more detail. But going back to those unique properties, that peat soil, like I said, is one of the things that makes it extremely unique ability because of their market timing that they can do for products, the types of products they can do. But also it's that irrigation system that I said. A lot of other areas, the arid areas where we're sending the water for agriculture, they actually have to do what's called pre-irrigation. So they have to irrigate the soil just to even get it to wet enough so that they can till it, if you will, and then water it again and again. They don't even have that passive. So you have to ask yourself, over that 6 years, 10 years, it's a 9-year construction, that wasn't really analyzed how, again, we're going to have to change those operations for those farmers that do remain. What's that impact overall going to be when you have to change your irrigation systems? But it's going to be additional treatment costs, potentially also for our urban intakes. The noise, when you read the construction sections of the plan, unfortunately, a lot of the construction is 24/7, and even the daytime, they plan on going till 10 o'clock at night. And that's not normal for most construction sites. It is going to be a lot on people. I know even in the Freeport, they paid for some of the people to actually live in alternative housing because you're talking ground shaking that's very intense, and you need to read the geology chapter to kind of get that, and that's why I say you have to read these different chapters. The geology and soils chapter make it clear that we may have additional subsidence and sinkholes that are creating because of that dewatering that I described. Now you've got a void, if you will, being created, plus we've got pile driving. And those are some of the issues that we've raised from a flood standpoint, too, that are concerning.
Do you have any different figures for the houses impacted by the noise issues? There was a chart.
Yeah,
showing
there are. I define it as over 100 or something.
Roughly 150 or something like that. Is that about right?
It's hard to say because both they come up with these radiuses of effects. In that case, I've not looked at that one. We have some engineers looking at the radius of that dewatering, though, and the lowered groundwater, because when I had asked about previously of them, you came up with 2,600 feet, I didn't see any appendix or anything that explained how you came up with that. Because a lot of the stuff they're at 10% design. There's just a lot they haven't looked at yet. But again, to be able to analyze even from a local perspective, but then from your perspective of Delta as a place, how you get there becomes very difficult if it's a professional judgment that you're going to then investigate later and find out differently. And that becomes important because only those within that 2,600 feet may get mitigated, and it's discretionary, and it could, become very more contentious than it already is. And certainly if you don't have running water, you've got noise and you've got vibrations to the level, according to that you can, buildings can come down. It's like the Horn of Jericho. I was watching the History Channel, and they were showing science and doing some of that. It's kind of amazing to think that can happen.
The History Channel didn't show the actual blowing of the Horn of Jericho.
No, it showed a science project in a lab that shows how you can use sound in order to make something fall apart. The particles will come apart.
Yep.
Well, Linda,
and so they were using it.
Another
as
thought
reference.
on this with the noise and disturbance. How does that affect land values?
Well, that's one of the
compensation.
Yeah, and that's one of the, when you read the abandonment, and I said it gets mentioned in several different chapters, abandonment of businesses and homes. The loss of property value is one of the reasons. And that's what gets really difficult and it's going to be difficult for them to figure out, how to deal with that. But it needs to be, because it shouldn't be a case where those people are forced to abandon their homes and can't get, or they have to sue to get compensation. Frankly, being in the footprint is really better, in my opinion, because at least I know I'm getting paid. There's an actual process. It's not discretionary, But things, when you're impacted like that, it becomes very discretionary. And then maybe even legal and costing you money. Well, you've already abandoned your home. Do you have money? I really don't know. But the other attributes that really make the Delta agriculture unique is the climate. We all call it locally the Delta breeze. And we were feeling it today, actually, really strong. But that actually is one of the things that makes the agriculture commodities be able to time markets differently. It was the soils, our irrigation abilities, and it's our good quality water, by the way, because those drainage systems too, we reuse it, and even we've had studies done the drainage when we reuse it internally, it's still good quality by the time, and so it reused even internally in the island several times. But we have to have that good water quality. But the climate is the Mediterranean climate, and these coastal breezes that we get help cool it down a little bit and create better markets for us. From a flood standpoint, one of the things that really didn't get, it kind of got mentioned, but we're going to end up having, and the Army Corps did comment on this, and they have some serious concerns, and they're going to have to deal with these and learn about what it's like to deal with the Corps in the 408 permit process when they get to 65% design. But they won't really officially engage you until you're at 65%. They'll do informal discussions with you in the meantime, and hopefully at least head you in the right direction, because otherwise it's crazy. But they're going to require them to be net, no net impacts to our flood capacity. And you heard me explain earlier that we already know we have capacity issues at Sutter Bypass, which is north. I think we still have some at Tisdale, although I will say DWR just recently did some clearing of vegetation and helped, and sedimentation, which are both potential issues being created by this plan. But there are 10 cofferdams that will go in, one at the Fremont Weir, 3 for the intakes, and the 6 barges. And I don't know if you read the recreation chapter or not, Steve, because the recreation chapter is very clear. These cofferdams have to stay in place during the construction. The barges say they'll take 5 years to construct. The intakes up to 6 years, 4 to 6 years. So those cofferdams are out in that water. What do you have? Constrained channels for flood flow for 6 years. 10 different places. Some of these channels, I think it's Woodward Canal, it ends up with a barge on both the north and the south side, so both sides. So you have to go and read those chapters. Navigation is a problem. Some of these areas are cut off. Now, they consider it temporary. I don't consider 5 years temporary myself. I have a different definition, apparently, of temporary. But so some of these areas, and that apparently is how you get to the San Joaquin area. It's a high water sport area for people to go right there. And but from a flood capacity, now I've got a flood capacity issue. It's not just navigation. And it's one of the things, again, that the Army Corps brought up in their comments is there was really no analysis of some of these flood impacts. And I remember being almost day one when the conservation measures come out. I remember going to the steering committee and saying, okay, I know you all think that conservation measures 2 through 22 are habitat projects, but in fact, they're flood projects because they are proposing to modify some facilities that are part of the state plan of flood control. And as I said, that Paterno decision is very clear about some of the problems of the plan, but that you weren't, and seepage was one of the issues. And seepage is, as I described, both from the conveyance facility and these habitat measures, one of the things that we can expect. Now, there are measures that you can deal with that, but it'll be important to really make sure that there's funding for those because, again, the state will be liable. We have given assurance to the federal government, and in Paterno, they did not find the district that I represent liable because they're only a local maintainer for the state. The facility is still the state's obligation because they gave the assurance. Every single one of those habitat measures that we talk about doing, whether it's for biological opinions or BDCP or anything else, if they're modifying that state plan of flood control, and then we have levee failures, and we did at Sutter Bypass, I forgot to mention that earlier, that was one of the problems too, is right near that forest that has grown, even though they were supposed to have conservation easements to keep it clean, there was a failure in that location. But same with Paterno, eventually there is a failure, and the state is liable. Now, in this case, because you will have something called the BDCP that are doing projects on our state plan of flood control, encroachments for the purpose of water conveyance, those facilities may now share some of that liability. I'm not an attorney, I don't know, but if I were them, I would really look at that and look at these costs and what Paterno says of why they ultimately were liable for that Flood fighting was not looked at. When you read the construction chapter, it's very clear these thousands of trucks, these worksite areas where they're going to put all this equipment and everything. And it's very obvious to us that those districts, reclamation districts, where particularly Conservation Measure 1 conveyance will be built, we cannot do any levee improvements because we can't compete with the construction project that they have going on. So that's a 10-year period. We won't be able to do any levee improvements and probably maintenance and probably flood fighting. Again, I've told the districts, if I were you, turn those back over to the state, at least during that 10-year period, maybe forever, maybe the water contractors ultimately, somebody's got to, because they shouldn't be liable if they've now modified and changed those levees, but particularly during construction, they're going to be very vulnerable, because as I said, that dewatering, they didn't analyze the dewatering and the sinkhole and subsidence on the levees and combined with the pile driving that will occur. And we have talked to our engineers, we will comment on the EIR. They have experienced fractures, if you will, in the levees. And you're talking, they said, like 3 levees away. So they said it's not just right next door. And these are just other much, much smaller construction projects in the Delta. So it's very concerning from that standpoint. One of the other issues for flood transportation, I've told them this, they analyzed the traffic volume and the pavement conditions, but they didn't analyze what's underneath the black pavement, and for the most of their road segments they are using, they are levees. And again, the amount of traffic volume, these trucks, and the weight. So it's the combination of how many 24/7 and volume. The levees aren't built for that, and so they will degrade those, and that's not even analyzed, so therefore it's not mitigated, which is one of the reasons I told the districts, turn these back over to the state. You should not have any liability because they don't have a plan to keep these up. I hope as they go forward they'll kind of work on those things. I think I brought those up. Then you get to, in your document from last month that talked about the fish, and I really encourage you to look at the fish as well. They're going to have impacts. Those noise and vibrations, they're impacted by those. The reduced water flows that are combined of, the diversion intakes themselves, but as well as the diversion that happens into the Yolo bypass, reduces those flows in the river and all of our streams and channels below that.
Ms. Terry, is it your position that every potential damage must be fully mitigated or avoided? I mean, is that your legal position?
I don't have a legal position because I'm not an attorney, so I don't.
Right.
The standard for CEQA, I don't know NEPA. CEQA is down to a less than significant. I guess the way I look at it as a Delta resident, so not even as North Delta or flood.
Different hat.
Yeah, my different hat. Thank you. My answer would be yes, and the reason I would say that is, I think we're all okay with sharing the responsibility for our statewide water supply, and we're already contributing to that. But in this case, this is the only HCP that I really know where you're going into someone else's backyard in order to use their properties for purposes of creating benefits in your areas. And as I said, they have real impacts because the habitat alone, over a 50-year period, will we as local maintainers have lands available to mitigate our projects, our levee improvements that with climate change need to be done. Not just climate change, I'll keep going back to that Paterno. If we do not keep at least our state plan of flood control facilities up, our state now has liability, and that liability keeps growing because of the Army Corps' path to kick all of our levees out of what's called their PL 8499, which is their rehabilitation money that we get after a flood failure. The last number I heard at our board meeting yesterday from the department was we're up to 63% of our project levies are now out of PL 8499 and no longer eligible. So again, it's more important as ever for us to keep these up because that's your insurance policy that you don't have the failure, if you will, right? That's your best insurance to avoid it and the costs, especially if we're not getting federal money. Which is why I really do keep encouraging some coordination, and I forgot to mention this earlier on the implementation committee. In my opinion, and from my association standpoint, it's not good enough to just say you're going to have DWR. As I've explained before, DWR has 2 divisions, 2 deputy directors, And I think it's appropriate to have both of those involved. There's clearly the water supply is involved in a lot of the habitat, but they don't do any of those Central Valley flood protection plan stuff in those projects that I was talking about. That's the other deputy director. It's the other division. So I'd really encourage you to try to get Gary Bardini and that side really involved, because that's where I think you, the Stewardship Council, can help that coordination that you'd think was really occurring, but I'm sorry to say just really isn't. We actually have a coordinating committee. We try to do it, but it's not there yet. So, but if you go to the fish, like I said, there are those impacts. If you read the red flags, just so you know, there are now the things that you think are being fixed when I looked in your documents. We are going to have reverse flows that are now be created in the North Delta. We're going to have some reduced flows in some of our channels, and according to the red flags, some of these are in critical habitat areas, and so they're concerned. Predation becomes an issue for these fish, the noise, the vibration that I mentioned. And so that's really concerning, because we need some physical mitigations in here, because it could very well, if we've got changes in water elevations because of those diversions that are coming out of the system, then we may need those temporary barriers that they put in every year, like at South Delta, in order for our intakes to still have access to their water supply. And so we're getting hit on water supply from all sides. The groundwater I mentioned, availability is going to be difficult. If we've got changes in surface water elevations that are lowered, then we may have high and dry intakes. We also would water quality. If the water quality, then what good is the water supply, even if I had it, but it's degraded, according to the water quality chapter. That they exceed both for a couple of the constituents, they double the chloride from the State Water Board's chloride, just so you know, they double it according to that chapter, so I'm not sure how that's a net zero. And then there's a couple of constituents that are also 303D listed that get increases. Particularly those seem to be down in Sassoon Marsh, which I'm not as familiar with. I was noticing that. But those seem to me, I'm hoping the Delta Stewardship Council will really try to look at what some of these unique values are that were identified in statute in terms of the agricultural resources, the community characteristics. Because if you don't have access to your parcels for those years, or it mentions in there, by the way, and I'll submit a paper to you if you want, but it talks about also not only will you have blight in terms of these abandonment of buildings, but even if people are leaving temporarily, just the maintenance and upkeep, these areas really do become quite blighted. And yeah, you can say they're in discrete areas, but they're literally what I think a lot of us would consider the heart of the Delta. You know, a high tourism area, a lot of high-end, high-value permanent crop areas. So these aren't low-value lands. So I hope the Delta Stewardship Council will try to take some time to think about what are the values, you know, what constitutes that really unique agricultural environment, because it is unique. And I only gave, I think, 3 examples, but I think I had 6 if I read them all.
Okay.
So look at those, but you have to look from chapter to chapter, because you'll see the impacts to agriculture in the soils chapter, the geology chapter from the subsidence that is going to occur, not because of peat soils. Now it's going to happen in other areas that don't have as much peat soils from the actual construction activity. So, you know, the water quality, you have to look at all of those, the socioeconomic abandonment. How is your Delta going to look after that? And I really hope and encourage that you will do that. I think that's kind of good for now, is I just really hope that you will take some time to look through what some of those values and define what you think those are, and try to see how through the multiple chapters they're being affected, and whether those mitigations are real or not, or whether they're really conditioned. The transportation mitigation that he mentioned of these local plans with the locals, the problem is if you don't reach agreement with the local government on what that local plan is to improve that road pavement, it becomes an unavoidable impact. That cost is left to the locals. So again, you get to that discretionary thing if you can't work that out. And if they think they don't have a cost share, because not if for this project they think their costs are 0, and you don't get a plan, now it's unavoidable, and all of those equipment impacts then become the locals' costs. So these are quite significant that I really hope you'll take a look at. Thanks.
Thank you very much.